Alrighty, everybody. So today we are going over question 4 of this unit, right? As we know, we just started the industrialization, and today we're still talking really about how are we going to get everything we need to survive, right? But on a bigger nose, where is all this labor coming from? Like, how are they getting all this labor for this new industrialization? So, the question of the day is, how did Great Britain have access to the labor? Excuse me. How did Great Britain have access to labor that they needed to industrialize, right? So as you see, we have some terms down here on the left that are going to be pretty important to what we're going to be talking about today. So, right, we have this picture, and my question to you guys, maybe you can write something down in your notebook or your packet. You can write something down and bring it to class for Thursday so we can talk about, what's going on in this picture, right? Because we sit here, we're thinking, what does this picture have to do with factories? Right? Because that's what we're learning about, right? We spent Tuesday talking about factories and this industrialization. Well, right here we just see a pasture, right? We see a farmer with his animals plowing his field. So what does this have to do with factories? Nothing, right? Well, what you might not realize is that this relationship between farming and manufacturing, this relationship might, what is it? Like, what is this relationship between these? Just because they're two different aspects, right? You have farming, and then you have industrialization, right? You have manufacturing. Just because they aren't related, that doesn't mean they aren't important. It necessarily doesn't mean they aren't important to each other, right? So we have to put ourselves in this perspective. I challenge you guys to think about, how are these things important to each other? How do they coincide or exist at the same time to create this bigger picture, right? How do these two things create the bigger overall picture of industrialization? All right, so it's important, I ask you guys, maybe write some notes down, something like that, to give yourself an opportunity to ask me questions to learn more. Okay, so as we move on, we'll be on the top of our packet, on the section that's titled "The Second Agricultural Revolution." Right, look for the thing that says question number 4. So this brings us here, right? We have the second agricultural revolution. Well, you probably say here, you have yourself thinking, the second one, well, when was the first one? Do you guys think we've ever talked about the first agricultural revolution? Well, if you're thinking hard enough, we have, right? And, basically this first revolution, right, this agricultural revolution was created when we started farming, right? That only makes sense, right? So the first agricultural revolution happened when we first started farming. So, right, that happened obviously very long time ago. And the base of this was the idea of people planting crops, rotating them, not rotating them, but, using tools to put the seeds in the soil, dig, let them grow, and then do the same thing over and over again, right? And that was the first idea of farming. But as we realized, things need to change. There's got to be more efficient ways to maybe do this farming to set us up on a better path. So the second agricultural revolution started around 300 to 400 years ago, right? So that puts us around, late 1600s to early 1700s, right as the time that we're talking about. And so we think about this prior knowledge to farming, right? Well, as we know, all things grow, all things change. There are always better ways to do things, and that's what they realize, right? And you know, as you continually grow stuff in the same way, you got to think there might be a better way or more efficient way to produce more crops, make more money, right? And that's what is here, because you got to think, doing the same thing over and over again, it's not always going to last. So this second agricultural revolution, right, this lasted, through the mid 1700s, right? And what's important about this time period is that, this revolution for farming or for agriculture, this was both a revolution in farming techniques and also farming technology, right? So we say techniques, and what we mean by techniques is this is how you do something, right? This is how something's done, right? That's a technique, right? There's certain techniques for everything, right? And the idea of this is that when we talk about techniques in farming, well, there was a revolution in the ways you could farm, right? We talk about efficiency, stuff like that. There's techniques and ways to do this, right? But we talked about a little bit. There was a revolution in technology, okay? And what I mean by that is there was now creations of new technologies that are available, right? And you guys will know after this video that these technologies are very, very important to the growth of agriculture. But what's important for you guys, we think about these new technologies, these new tools, well, where do we think they're made at, right? Exactly. So there's a little bit of a connection for you guys. So, right, the second revolution saw basically significant innovations in both of these. Okay, they saw significant innovations in both technique and technology. And in Great Britain at this time, these new agricultural techniques and technology basically produced something called, well, I guess they produced greater yields, right? And when I say yields, this is an important terminology for you guys to understand. Yields means food, or means crops, right? The more yield you have, that equals the more crops. Okay, so yield equals crops. All right. So these technologies and these techniques were able to produce more yields. Well, what does that mean? Right? And we'll get into that later in this lesson, but you think a society might change if they have greater yield, right? They have more production of food, right? More crops. Do you think this will advance a society, right? So this brings us to our first thing right here, right? We have crop rotation. Okay. And crop rotation, right? This basically became prominent in the second agricultural revolution, right? Right around the late 1600s, this idea of crop rotation became very prominent. And, the problem kind of got towards it a little bit before this. But, this problem that we had, right, is that we talk about year after year doing the same thing. I'll give you guys an example, something to think about. What happens to an area, right? You have something called a man-made path, right? It's basically like you see this area of grass, right? That was never a path, but people walked through that path continuously over and over and over and over again, right? So it basically just dulled it down to dirt or mud, right? And you can replant it, right? They'll replant it, regrow the crops there. And what ends up happening again is that it goes away, right? This grass doesn't stay. So do you think we can put the same idea towards farming, right? So the problem that they had here is that if you plant stuff in the same soil the same crop year after year after year, right? You keep planting in the soil, turning it over, harvesting it, season's over, replant it, same thing over again. Do you guys think this soil is going to stay healthy? Do you think it's going to have the right nutrients for you to continue to grow? Probably not, right? So eventually the soil became exhausted, right? And what this means is that you've drawn out all these nutrients out of the soil, right? And so it loses its nutrients, right? These nutrients that the soil has, it'll go away, right? When you continually repeat it, it goes away. So then you guys are probably thinking, well, how does this soil get its nutrients back, right? Because now the soil is in a place where it can't support the crops anymore. So now that leaves this farmer with two options, right? There's basically two ways to fix this. Well, I guess technically one if you think about it literally, but the first way is that if you live near like a river valley, near a river, and it floods, well, that flood water is going to come through. It's going to, regrow your soil. It's going to give it that nutrients it needs to continue and be successful. Well, then that leaves us with the next part. Well, what if you don't live by that? Well, if you don't, you basically have to move to new farmland. So you think about that. Where you live in this area, once all that soil dries up and it's not nutrient anymore, you basically have to move your whole family and go somewhere else and start a new farm. Do you think that's efficient? You think that's an efficient way to live? No, right? You have to bring up your whole family, go somewhere else just to start your crops over again. So they created this idea of something called crop rotation, right? And they had this idea, they came to this realization that there's two types of crops, right? You have summer crops and you have winter crops. Okay, and these winter crops, basically they're planted they're planted in the fall and they grow during those winter months and you harvest them in the spring. Right? So you grow them out the fall, right? But these are underground growers, right? These are crops that grow underground. Like these could be, I don't know, it could be carrots, it could be what else? Like potatoes, beets, something like that grows out of the ground, right? That grows underground that you have to pull up and you have to get it out of there, right? And that's why they're able to grow in the wintertime, right? Well, we have summer crops, and these are a lot of the crops that you see when you're driving around in Ohio during the summertime, during the fall, right? And these are basically crops that are planted in the spring and they grow above ground in the summer and are harvested in the fall. So, this could be anything that grows above ground, right? So this could be wheat, corn, maybe stuff like that, where you see it growing all throughout the summer. By the time it's fall, it's nice and beautiful. Okay, but what they realize is that these require two different nutrients, right? So there's one that doesn't need the super nutrient, like the super nutrient dense soil, like the summer ones might need, right? The winter ones don't need that, right? But the summer, they need that really nutritious soil to continue to grow and be healthy and be a strong crop for your farm, right? So what they did basically is that they started dividing up these fields, and so you would separate it in, right? You'd section one part of your field into summer crops, one part of your winter crops, right? And you would grow them, then the next year you would switch them, right? So now that stuff where the winter crops were, right, they don't need as much nutrients. That's still nutrient, nice, rich soil. You can now move those winter ones over to the other one, while that soil continues to become more nutrient. Well, eventually, right, that's gonna run out, right? That's eventually gonna go bad. And soil, what they realize at this time, requires nitrogen to replenish, and they realize that this comes from animal poop, right? And as we know today, fertilizer. And so what they did is, if you look at this picture in the crop rotation, right, you see number 3 and it's that animal eating, grazing, right? So they added a third field for animals able to graze and take a dump, poop, leave out what they need, and that would replenish that soil. So then year after year, they would rotate, 1 would go to 2, 2 would go to 3, 3 would go to 1, right? It would just be a circle. It would restart. So you had this continuous cycle of rotating your crops, and they would all be healthy. You would be able to continue to have a strong farm. And, right, this 3-field system that we know of is crop rotation, right? And this basically established a more permanent settlement within the areas, right? You now had a permanent settlement for your family, and you had a permanent settlement to now grow and become somewhat wealthy, right? Because we talked about yield, right? You were able to get more product, right? This increased yields, which meant that you were able to grow more often, right? And later on, they found out that there were certain plants that were able to pull this nitrogen out of the air, right? And then once they would pull it out and contain it, they would then deposit it into the soil. So if you didn't have animals, you were able to plant such thing called as legumas, right? And these were various types of beans. And this solved issues for those who didn't have livestock. Okay, so this is important. Okay, so we now have this rotation where they're able to become more successful, basically. Right, but now we move on from techniques, we go to technology. Okay, and as you see, that is a wooden plow on your screen right now, right? And plowing is important, right? And it's important to turn over the soil and get the nutrients that had gone down to the lower parts of the soil, right? This is known as turning the soil, right? Because not all this soil is just going to sit on those top 5 layers that the wooden one would get, right? It would go a little bit deeper. So when it goes deeper, they needed something to get all the way down there to be able to successfully get this. And, that's important for them to understand, to be able to pull out that nutrients, rotate it back to the top, let the others go to the bottom and continue to grow, right? So we have a wooden plow. And as you guys probably realize, what happens when wood gets wet, or wood, you continually use wood over time, right? It dulls down just like anything, but it was more often that it was going to break, right? These wooden blades, right? They were more susceptible to break, and they wouldn't last long. They were not as heavier, but they would break down. But since they were lighter, you were easier to steer it, right? You could put it on your horse, just around their collar, and it would be successful, right? But, right, they created the iron plow, okay? And as you know, this is probably going to be a little bit sturdier, a little bit more heavier, right? And that's going to be better, right? Because now instead of getting to those, first 5 layers, you're now able to get, 7, 8 layers deeper, and you're able to reach more soil, right? Bring more of that up, and you can be more efficient on your farm. That's important because now they're able to rotate crops more often. But not only that, this iron plow, it's going to last a little bit longer, and it's going to be able to break through that tougher soil, right? That wood one that we saw right here, it's not going to be able to break through those really tough, hard layers of soil. But this iron one, right, this, as they call it, the heavy plow, was a little bit tougher, right? And it'd be able to go through that tougher soil and get those more richer layers of soil that had been down at the bottom, okay? But who's pulling these, right? Well, we have horses. And before, on the wood one, right, there we just have a collar around the neck of that horse. They would just have it around the neck of that horse, and it wasn't going to be that much stressful, right? But you put a heavy plow on the neck around a horse, just the neck of it, right? It's going to choke them, and they're smart enough. They're not going to go till it chokes them, but it's going to choke them, right? And now you're going to be tiring out your animal faster. You're going to have to, you're not going to get as much done as you hoped for. So they have this creation of this full body harness, right? And this required, right? We said this heavy plow required a new kind of harness that basically would disperse this force needed to overcome the friction of the soil, across the animal's body, except, to avoid just being it on the neck and to prevent that pain and injury, right? Because as you get deeper, that soil's tougher. There's going to be more friction. That animal is not going to be able to just hold it on their neck. So if you look at this picture, right, not only is it around the neck, but it goes around the body and the back, right? So now disperses this friction, this force around them to the rest of their body. And, once this improvement started to be more commonly used, agricultural productivity, right, increased, right? They were able to get more done. Okay, so this is important to understand these technologies and why they are important to the greater growth and success of this agricultural movement. All right. So as we move forward, right, we have yields. Okay. And, yields at this time had increased. Right. And this idea of a yield means how much crops it produces, right? So if you see down at the bottom, it says increased yield means more food, which equals more people, right? But this idea of yield, right? So if you have non-nutrient crops, right, non-nutrient soil, you're not going to grant a high yield, right? You're not going to be intaking as much crops as a person who, on the other hand, did have nutrient soil, right? So nutrients equals more crops equals more yield. All right. And more yield and crops equals more people, right? So this means there's more food now in this area, right? There's more food available, which means more people can move into that area and eat, right? And, so if you look at these pictures, right, population from 1700 to 1850, Britain alone went from 5.75 million to 18 million, right? So if you industrialize, right? We talk about this industrialization, but if you have more stuff to offer as a society, as a community, right? You have this food available, this influx of food. More people are going to move there, not only for these jobs, but now they have food and they can continue this family, right? They can continue to grow their families in this area. So, but because of that, you now need fewer farmers, right? And, fewer farmers are needed to produce these areas because of the creation of these new technologies. Farmers had become more efficient, right? So you lose that hope because you can just do it with your animal and yourself, right? So what we'll get into in this next lesson is that, many of these farmers that had lost out on these jobs because of how easy it became, well, these workers are still going to seek employment, right? They're not just going to be unemployed because they can't farm anymore. But what did we talk about Monday, right? We talk about this idea of creation of these factories, right? This creation of labor, right? Well, they're going to seek these jobs or this employment in manufacturing. So that is where we end off today, right? We talk about the importance of the creation of these new technologies and new techniques for farming and how it advanced this society in Great Britain during the industrialization. All right. Well, I hope you guys have questions for class Thursday and you enjoyed that puzzle.